Welcome to This Week in Local, a Localogy podcast featuring lively conversations about the local digital ecosystem, hosted by Localogy analysts Mike Boland and Charles Lachlan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Local. I'm Mike Boland, and my guest today is David Arslanian, Managing Director of Progress Partners. So, David, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, absolutely. So frequent listeners of this podcast know your voice. We have you on periodically as our sort of resident expert on all things finance and corporate doings. And we thought we'd get you back in the studio to talk about the big story on everyone's mind over the past few weeks, which of course is the sort of leadership shakeup at OpenAI. But more specifically, now that it's sort of winding down and reaching resolution, like what happened exactly? What can we learn from it, etc. So let's jump right in. So to sort of, I guess, level set, let's sort of have you quickly summarize for our audience, not necessarily the timeline and the blow by blow, but like at a high level, what kind of unfolded there?
Yeah. Well, really, I think the surprise to everyone may not have been what happened, but how it happened.
Yeah.
And then because it's not unusual for for CEOs to be replaced by boards. That's nothing unusual. It's not unusual for boards and CEOs to disagree.
Right.
I think what caught everyone by surprise, or at least those not in the deep know, was at the speed and what really appeared to be the thoughtlessness with which everything happened. That's where I think that's what we're all sort of aghast about.
Yeah. And, so one of the sort of frustrating things is that, those who know exactly the firsthand accounts of what's going on was like, locked up in NDAs and just sort of standard, non-disclosure stuff for board dynamics. There are a lot of clues out there, right? And we've all been sort of speculating, following clues. So let's talk about our theories of what led to the initial firing of Sam Altman, which I think was on November 16th. It was that Friday where it all sort of took us all by surprise. I'll kick it off. My theory is that, among other things, it seemed like the board may have just gotten spooked, right? I mean, there's so much hand-wringing out there about AI, and it's moving too fast, and it could be like the downfall of everything and the robot uprising. And, I think that they didn't want that blood to be on their hands. And I think that they felt that there may have been some misalignment with the advancements that Sam Altman was pursuing and perhaps like going in directions that they thought were too fast. So maybe they got scared. I'm not sure. It could be a combination of things, but it seems like that was part of it. What do you think about either that or some other theories about what caused all this?
Yeah, well, look, the statement, the original statement was that he wasn't forthcoming or totally transparent with the board or completely honest. Whatever words they sort of chose there. The way people read into it was that Sam was hiding something from them, or he wasn't being complete in his descriptions of what was going on. And to the layperson, I think that spooked a lot of people because, look, we're all inventing these things in our heads, what's coming now, with AI. And so you can only imagine, or how that might translate into sort of either fear or nervousness around that level of knowledge at the board that they had of this technology and what it's capable of. And if they didn't believe that you were being 100%, clear with us, where we're talking about hand-wringing, they might have immediately jumped to certain conclusions, just like we all would if we didn't believe we had complete knowledge, which, by the way, clearly none of us have at this point of what's going on.
Yeah, and it seemed like there were a lot of missteps on the board, but I guess in their defense, it's easy for us to all sort of critique, but when they're, sort of on the line in terms of oversight and the sort of responsibility for such a powerful technology, it can be, I guess, seen that, you can't blame them for if they did indeed get spooked, if that's part of it. But anyway, another thing that we know, besides the speculation and what drove them to do it, one thing we do know is that at least what enabled this to happen was the actual sort of the board structure itself. It's sort of an uncommon sort of corporate structure that they have in their oversight, which ironically Sam Altman sort of helped configure as one of the co-founders, but sort of help us understand that angle, the actual structure.
Yeah, I think in its initial formation, Sam and the other board members, founders of the product and developers really did believe that having it more structured as a nonprofit would, I don't know this for a fact, but they this is my personal opinion, which is for what it's worth, whatever there. But they actually believed it was going to put it in a better position to take advantage of sharing and keeping the sort of rails on it by sort of group or a group dynamic think around
checks and balances.
Checks and balances. That's exactly right. I really do think that's what they thought, and that actually you have to again sort of separate the potential of what happened with maybe the structure itself. The structure actually still might be correct. I don't want to just leap to a conclusion that it was a bad structure, but it certainly precipitated then the rest of what happened with his firing and how that went down because of that structure and who they had on the board. And really, if you think about the mandate of a nonprofit versus the mandate for this is at a board level, the mandate for a nonprofit versus the mandate for a for-profit organization really just breaks down into money, right? One is to the shareholder value and to the ultimate outcome of the mission, right? And that's what a nonprofit is about. And those will never those will always be in conflict. I don't know how you would reconcile those two things.
Yeah, and besides the mission, I mean, part of it is also just like sort of legal and accounting specifics of how those two types of entities work. But also, I think that I think you're right in the checks and balances, and you're right that now that all this has happened, it might be a shame if we sort of lose that because that. Checks from lots of different perspectives is always good. But also, I think one thing that could have driven that, secondarily, albeit, could be just sort of the optics of having a nonprofit that is stewarding this technology that, again, a lot of people are sort of worried about the societal impact. They could point to the fact that they're not necessarily sort of just this like cutthroat capitalistic endeavor, but one that is also sort of aiming for humanistic outcomes.
Yeah. So for certain, this isn't the first time this type of a structure has been tried, but it is for certain that it is the first time it's been tried with such an important new technology company that is emerging, right? I mean, so like take that. Right. It's like this is a first. And I think that given the importance of AI, which has been around for a long time, let's also separate that, right? That AI has been here for a while. And
I remind people of that all the time. Like the latest wave of generative and conversational AI, large language models, like that's just the latest wave. But like AI is all around us. Like autocomplete on your iPhone is AI. Right?
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And there's levels of it. And, and maybe this is the time that it really gets integrated into society, in some specific way. The example you could use there is like, hey, look, the mobile phones have been around forever and people had been using them to make phone calls forever. It wasn't until the iPhone was introduced, right? It was still fundamentally a phone, but it offered a new set of capabilities that just made it more about the way people interacted with it. So maybe this is that moment, right?
Yeah.
Let's hold it at that, right?
But it's an inflection rather than a new
Exactly. It takes on a new slope of the line, right? And so that's exciting. And the board, I think, really did believe that they were that that they are that type of a company in this moment. And when you do have that type of power and what they believed was an ethical driver that they needed to steward here, that probably took over versus profitability versus the money side, right?
Yep.
And then all of a sudden that conflict between the two is no longer something which you could bear, and it sort of breaks, right? It's that fissure, it's that crack, it's that earthquake that happens when the tension builds.
Yeah. Now, speaking of that conflict, sort of going next in chronological order, Sam Altman was sort of invited back to the CEO role after some sort of negotiating and like restructuring. And a lot of that, him coming back, was due to a lot of influential pressure from that sort of money side of that dichotomy you just characterized. And it was from investors. It was from, Sam himself is very powerful in terms of his sphere of influence within the company. Employees sort of banding together and say they're all going to quit out of protest. All of that stuff. So, all of that outweighed that initial sort of force, we'll call it, that was behind his firing. So what are the lessons there in terms of that power struggle? Who ended up winning? What does it say about the real sort of driving forces in our sort of tech and business world that surrounds us? And before I hand it over to you to answer, I'll tee you up with a quote, a great quote that I heard or I read. It was in TechCrunch from Alex Wilhelm. And he had this sort of tongue-in-cheek sort of lead to his article, which was, so there were some nonprofit folks up against the wall of money and influence. Guess who won? So, I mean, that really like succinctly describes the long-winded point I just made. But what do you think about that? Like what the takeaway is in terms of that power struggle?
Yeah, well, so certainly everyone should take away the number one winner here was Microsoft.
Yeah.
And if I ever thought in all my years I was ever going to say those words again,
Yeah, right.
Microsoft was going to once again reign supreme. My goodness, give the Microsoft CEO Satya. I mean, like he. It was masterful, really, on his part. Just to be clear, I really my personal belief is he did a great job. He ended up looking like the sort of the balancing act that he played of I love AI and the humanity of it, and yet at the same time my company has a $50 billion investment, or whatever the investment was in this thing, and we have to be good stewards of our capital. I mean, just beautifully orchestrated, right?
Absolutely.
On his give him and that team a lot of credit, and I actually think that they will come out long term to great benefit here. But to your point, that conflict that eventually reached and bubbled to the conclusion, what lessons can we learn? Actually, look, one of the things that I took away, and I have sat on boards myself, and it's really challenging. Nothing like a board like OpenAI, but you're always confronted with what is reality against what the facts are. And so you have to constantly be listening, and you listen for the nuances that make you think, okay, this is the right decision versus this. And then oftentimes, the best boards I've sat on, you go away and you sort of think about it just one more time, before you come back. And what it really felt like here, I have to say, getting back to our sort of opening here, was that they made a real snap decision. And I get the need to make snap decisions at times, but it didn't feel like they were at that moment. And boy, if they were at that moment, I think that should just be like, we should uncover more about what that moment was, that was forcing them to turn a hand like that, for those, poker players, it's basically like making a decision on the first card that you get. It's possible you can be right, that 100%, but you're still going to get a couple more cards. Like,
Yeah.
play those cards, and it felt like they just made a decision on that first card. And that's a tough one. It's tough for the board. It's why I think Larry Sumner's and I'm blanking on the other board member that came on, but like, it feels like they wanted like a new set of hands at the table that were just going to be a little bit more thoughtful. And I hate to say that to the board members that are leaving, but it feels like that needed to be done to some degree. It's almost like it's too important not to get those steady hands in there.
Absolutely. And like, back to our sort of theories and all the other theories that are floating around out there about the sort of driving forces for the initial firing. It has been stated that Sam Altman was very critical of one of the board members. I believe her name was Susan Toner.
Yeah.
Helen Toner, excuse me.
Yeah. That's right.
Because she had written an academic paper that was overly critical of OpenAI, which you could argue is sort of put her in a position of conflict in terms of her responsibility to the board and the fiduciary state of the company if she's out there trashing it.
Actually, I think that's a great, there, you lined up the problem. She wasn't thinking about a fiduciary responsibility. She was thinking about a moral and ethical one. Yeah. And at a nonprofit, right, that is the guiding principle, right, is often less fiduciary, right, and more about ethical and ethically driven decision making around your mission or your ethos. When you're at a nonprofit,
it sets up a conflict inherently.
It does, and inherently a lot of. By the way, again, going back to it, this is not new. This is very typical of a nonprofit. For those of us who have dealt with nonprofits before, they're wonderful in their mission, mission, vision, values, right? Which don't necessarily equal fiduciary, smart or intelligent decision making, and they don't necessarily have to do that. But in a for-profit, you're as a board member, your responsibility is to your shareholders, right? And driving value. And right or wrong, you people out there listening, I'm sorry, I'm not making a judgment on whether that is correct or not. But that's what most board members of for-profits have to think about.
They have to,
right?
Now, the other sort of angle buried within the Helen Toner situation is that, so you said, why didn't they wait around for their second and their third card? And it makes you think that the fact that they made a snap decision meant that there must have been some sense of urgency or some other factor at play, because otherwise it goes against any sort of strategic sort of thinking. So what is that thing that caused that urgency? And it could be power play, politics, the fact that Sam Altman was potentially trying to push out Helen Toner for that sort of academic paper, the fact that he thought that she wasn't acting in a fiduciary responsible way with the company. So in return, it then became a power struggle of her gaining sort of favor and votes on the board to in turn get rid of him first. Again, that's a lot of speculation right there. But so in addition to everything else we mentioned, it could have been some politics and power struggling happening.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, it is never absent, right, in any of these situations, actually. Politics, power.
Just watch Succession, right?
Please. My own family, come by my house for dinner sometime, right? That's always sort of at play. It's innate in our being, right?
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what, this is probably the single thing that has confounded me and the whole situation is that like I said, you make decisions, these things shouldn't be snap decisions. Well, the Toner thing, actually, she makes it feel like it was more thought out. Right. If you think of the show Succession, right, often these things are like thought out over periods of time, or the way that they set it up. Right. It's not a snap. It's actually this person has been thinking about it for 25 years, and positioning this perfectly for this moment. No, I don't get that feeling that was the way this played itself out. It really did feel like they made a set of decisions, and if you look at even the way the co-founder apologized after he fired Altman, that
Yep.
lends me to think that he was not in the right state of mind when he made the decision to have a vote that ultimately ousted him, right?
Yeah.
If he had thought that through, he would have said, no, I'm not, you know what? Hey, board, today isn't the day to decide this. Let's take one more night and think about this. Let's have one more conversation, that leads us to a further thinking, so that the very next day after making that decision, you don't issue an apology to the person you just fired saying, I stand with you, but I had to fire you.
Yeah,
Like,
I actually read that slightly different. I think it was
yeah, please.
Ilya Sutskever, one of the
Yes.
board
Yeah.
members.
Yeah.
And he, that tweet he sent that he was like, I regret being part of that. My
Yeah.
read was that he was like the one dissenting vote or one of the dissenting votes,
Yeah.
but he has to be attached to the board decision otherwise. And he wanted to sort of let the world know that, like, yeah, this is happening, but I didn't want it to. Or it was a mea culpa in the way that you described it. We'll never know.
But maybe when the book is written,
Maybe we will know. Yeah, true.
or Sorkin writes the play on it. Yeah, I mean, one of the two, right?
Yeah. Now, let's talk about sort of where we are now,
Mhm.
going forward. Is it a better place, a worse place? You mentioned that, like, potentially some of those checks and balances that were in place, the good parts of it
Yep.
may have been eroded.
Mhm.
We now have a newly constructed board. I think there's still a few seats that haven't been determined, but now we have Brett Taylor,
Yep.
who is the former co-CEO of Salesforce.
Yep.
He founded FriendFeed back in the day, which was bought by, I think, Meta.
Yep.
And then his second company was bought by Salesforce. Just, well known in the Valley, Brett Taylor.
Yep.
Quora CEO, Adam D'Angelo, I think you mentioned him. And then
Larry Summers.
Larry Summers, who you did
Yeah.
mention. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So those
Yeah.
are the three that we know about.
Yep.
So I guess the question is, what's your level of confidence about where we are now? I think you were right in that some kinks were ironed out and maybe we're better for it, or OpenAI is better for it going forward. What's the sort of net effect? They may have lost the structure that was good, or maybe gained some new, a great sort of institutional learnings. Where do you see them now?
Yeah. Yes, I do believe. My feeling is that this will be for the better for OpenAI as a firm, and I'll say the word firm because I'm not sure if the nonprofit structure will ultimately last, and against the for-profit side of the business. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but it feels like that will have played its last tune at some point here.
Yeah.
So I do think that's better. Boards are they're there to serve a purpose. At the end of the day, the CEO really does control things, especially on the day-to-day. And so has it changed from that perspective? Sam's back. So no. Has Sam learned something here? I'm sure. He certainly learned who not to trust on the board, right? But if you did believe in Sam before, great, you're in the same spot. If you didn't believe in Sam before, then you're in the same spot. Basically, you still have him as the CEO, and you don't believe in him. So,
well, he probably has more power now after he's come back.
Yeah, that's right. I think he does. And again, right or wrong, he went through it. He knows it. It's always hard to say. You got to see these things now play out to give a real firm answer one way or the other.
And I should mention also, while we're laying out the construction of the new board, and Microsoft, you mentioned Microsoft as the big winner. I completely agree. Microsoft now has I believe, non-voting observational seat.
Observer. Yeah, they're an observer. Yeah, they should have had that at the beginning. Honestly, that is indicative of how frenzied the overall AI space had become in the past 6 months here, where they gave such a large chunk of money with absolutely zero rights assigned to it. And so as much as you could have said Microsoft screwed up doing that initially, they got to the right spot. And that it feels more like luck right now than anything else. But they got to the right spot and they were the winners here. That's my belief.
So we're sort of winding down here, almost out of time. But in closing, we talked about a lot of lessons, a lot of learnings. What other lessons would you advise to our audience about, thoughtfulness in constructing a board? There's probably no one size fits all answer, but just at a high level, the level of thought that needs to be put into it, particularly in areas like AI that are emerging, possibly have some distrust and some, fear surrounding them. What else can we learn from this fiasco?
For your listeners and for those out there with their own companies and their own boards, I actually thought this was a great learning moment for a lot of people. That just goes to show you how dysfunctional a board can be at any level. We often think the large companies have these unbelievable boards that are aligned and capable. No, it's really, it happens all the time. This is not a surprising event that happened, really. I think it
was just so high profile because of OpenAI,
That's exactly right. Yeah. Exactly. But this happens all the time. And it's a good lesson for all of us that sit on boards of how we should act and do things and be thoughtful and not just make snap judgments, right? These things do have real world implications, as they did here, and so this is a great learning experience for me. I saw it, I thought to myself, gosh, I think of the times I made a snap decision where I said, of course it needs to be this, for whatever reason, and not being thoughtful that, it's this, but, I believe this, but, here's where I can see the other side, or here's how I believe we should or could do things a little differently. I think that's a great lesson to be taken away here for your listeners. For me, I took it away, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about if OpenAI itself is better for all of this. I guess you could say that we're all better for it in terms of getting like just a sort of classic HBS case study that was so high profile that it was sort of in everyone's news feed. So I think we can all sort of learn from it. So that's great.
It played out right before our eyes. We all got to learn from it. There will be plenty more written about it. I'm sure half of what we talked about today will be wrong at some point. That's the best part of these real near-term events. There's not a lot of perspective yet, and we're giving our thoughts on it. But there's not going to be a real story written until years from now, and then we'll learn.
Well, in the meantime, it is a great thought exercise, so we appreciate your insights. We'll have to end it there. But thank you, David, for being on the show.
Great. Enjoy it as always, and look forward to speaking again soon.
Yeah, so thanks everyone for listening. This has been This Week in Local. Stay tuned every week for more episodes. You can find the show on all major podcast networks and find out more at localogy.com. Please subscribe, like, and comment. Your engagement helps others find us. So I'm Mike Boland. My co-host is Charles Lachlan. Our producer is Dara Sweat. This week's guest has been David Arslanian. You can find out more about David and Progress Partners in the show notes. So thanks for listening and see you next week.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Localogy's This Week in Local with Mike Boland and Charles Lachlan. Be sure to subscribe for more.